But if the victim was engaged or married, the penalty is death. So why this huge discrepancy?
This discrepancy is because verses 28 and 29 are not about assault.
All right, let's see it.
Let's go back to verse 23 to look at the entirety of the passage.
So the passage actually begins in verse 22, but including verse 22 requires we grapple with some inconsistencies that make it very difficult to try to argue that this is a comprehensive and systematic set of laws based on reality, because it's not. These laws were never enforced. They were never intended to be enforced. They are propaganda. They are rhetoric. They are intended to say, look how just and ordered and righteous these laws in our society are. We've thought of everything. And they haven't, because verse 22 is about a woman who's already married, an isha. It doesn't say anything about what to do if it happens in a city versus if it happens in a field, or if it's forced, or if it's consensual. And the main reason is because consent wasn't really a thing back then. Nobody cared what the woman thought, because she was not an active consensual partner in a sexual act. Sexual acts back then were things that an active sexual agent, a man, did to a passive receptive object, a woman. And so it doesn't matter what the woman wants. The woman's going to have done to her what the man wants to do. And so verse 22 doesn't allow for the possibility of sexual assault. And obviously that would happen in real life. So the law is not comprehensive, is not adequate.
The implication here is that if this is non-consensual, that woman has the opportunity to cry out for help because she's in a city. Now, looking at the ancient context, cities were very compact, very dense. If an assault is taking place, trust me, people are going to hear it.
So this is just flatly false, and also there is no such implication, because anciently the consent of the passive receptive sexual object in a sexual encounter was just entirely immaterial. It did not matter, and you cannot find any passage where consent is brought up. But I want to make another point here. Deuteronomy talks about removing this evil from among you, which reflects this idea that we see in other places, and most explicitly in the holiness legislation, where these actions created a kind of metaphysical contamination that polluted the land, and if it was not purged from the land and from the temple, then they ran the risk of the land vomiting them out. And in Leviticus 20 we see a reflection of this as well, with a long list of sexual indiscretions. And you'll note that, as with Deuteronomy 22 and Leviticus 20, the consent of the passive receptive sexual object is simply immaterial. And as with Deuteronomy 22, if the sexual act happens, both partners must be executed in order to adequately purge that metaphysical contamination, irrespective of their consent. Leviticus 20 nowhere references any kind of consent whatsoever. We're dealing with a social hierarchy of domination here, and agency always flows downstream. And so the people being run over by that agency, their agency doesn't matter at all. And this is why in all of Leviticus 20 and in all of the other legislation in the Hebrew Bible that has to do with sexual indiscretions, the agent, the one who is acting, the one who is responsible, is always a man, except the one sexual indiscretion where a woman could be the active agent acting upon a passive object who is further down that social hierarchy from them. And that is the law that prohibits a woman from engaging in sexual intercourse with an animal, because that is the only social agent in this hierarchy that would be beneath a woman. So importing our own ideas about sexuality and justice and consent and these things into the Bible totally obscures what the authors were trying to say and the conceptual frameworks with which they were working, which is what this creator is doing, because they are not concerned for what the authors were trying to do. They're concerned for reading their own ideologies into the text and skirting around any data that might complicate that, as we're going to see.
However, if she does cry out, only the man is going to die.
Now we're making things up. This law is in no way, shape, or form whatsoever about attempted sexual assault. It does not address what happens if he tries to lie with her, but she cries out and he is prevented from carrying through. This law is only about what happens if he does lie with her. And it says if it happened in a city, then she didn't cry out.
For he found her in the countryside, and the betrothed young woman cried out, but there was no one to save her. The first thing to note here is that sexual assault is considered equal with murder.
Yeah, the text says absolutely no such thing whatsoever. It brings up the case of a man rising against another to kill him, to suggest that it is structurally parallel in that she, like the victim of the killing, was a victim, was the one who was being attacked. And note, this does not raise the question of whether or not she wanted it at all. It presupposes that she was an unwilling participant in this. And the same is true of the previous verse. The only question is, did she stop it by crying out?
Now, what does Dan have to say about this passage?
He seizes her, and the verb tafas refers to physical restraint.
The word tafas simply means to lay hold of or grab. There is no actual indication of force here in this passage.
So this creator is engaged in a bit of a rhetorical sleight of hand, cutting me off before my statement that undermines their claim here. They're claiming that this can just mean to hold or to grab or to handle in a way that doesn't imply force, and that nothing in the passage implies force. But what they prevented me from saying was that every time the direct object of this verb is a human, it is about force. It is about physical restraint. It is only about generically handling or holding or grabbing without force if the direct object is an inanimate object and is not a human. And so this creator is quite knowingly cutting out information so that they can assert their falsehood and not be caught out.
The author is using the word in contrast to the word hazak back in verse 25, where it is referencing force.
So the notion hazak is the technical term that is used to refer to forcible sexual assault is simply false. Tafas and hazak are synonyms. They have significant semantic overlap. They're just varying their terminology. And we can go look at a third synonym, lakach, which means to take, which can also mean to seize using force, or it can mean to marry a woman. It's the verb that's used to refer to a man taking a woman in marriage. But if we go look at the sexual assault of Dinah, the text says, he took her, lakach, and lie with her. And so it's just using the third synonym. And so it's just using another synonym because this was not technical terminology. They did not have a standardized way to refer to this. You just used some verb that meant to physically restrain and then the verb to lie with. And that's exactly what's going on in verse 28.